Hello, hello. This is the My Artifact episode number 3690. Today's date is 8th of November 2025. It's been almost like a morning at 7:13 a.m. It's a bit more cold here. Whatever. Let's just jump into the question. Okay. Yeah. All right. The question is, what if consciousness survive after death? Oh, that is a really good question. Okay, so first of all, what exactly is this question and why am I asking this question to myself? This is what if question. Why am I asking this question to myself? What if question is always really interested way to give the answer. It kind of like force you to think about that reality. And when I try to create that reality or when I try to construct that reality, it required knowledge. And when I utilize that, whatever the knowledge I have to make this reality, it felt good. Like it felt good on something, like basically it felt something that there is a kind of like a something, some sort of thought inside of me that never gets out. Because of I ask such a question, it get out, it get free to express themselves. I don't know how do I supposed to explain this thing, but it does feel good. All right. Disclaimer: the information that I'm trying to tell you is not exactly right or is not exactly wrong either. It is just my opinion. So do not believe in any kind of like some information that I'm saying, or do not seek for any kind of like some information that I'm saying. It is just my opinion, raw, unfiltered. Okay, yeah. Just like everyone's our opinion, it's my opinion, and opinion are subjective regarding about people to people. All right. I'm asking this question is because of I'm kind of like somebody getting freedom to kind of like somebody said some sort of things and it felt good. All right. Okay. Now let's proceed to the question. The question is that, okay, what if the consciousness survive after death? Well, first of all, let's just understand a couple of things. Okay. What is exactly consciousness? A consciousness means like that the way that we feel. Usually is this thing na ki our consciousness, let me tell you one thing. Okay, since the beginning of our humankind, okay, we always think that ki we are just a kind of like a something, a bicycle. Okay, yeah. And our soul is kind of like a somebody drive that bicycle. Like the bicycle is a kind of like a somebody physical body. Okay, yeah. And there is a kind of like a somebody soul is kind of like a inside of us that kind of like a drive this kind of like somebody body. But why we think like that? What exactly is this reason? Is because of that ki there are so many things that we could do in our mind, but we can't do in our head. Example. Okay, yeah, if you're not really understanding, let's just understand by simple thing. Okay, yeah. Now basically if I'm gonna imagine that I'm gonna fly, like basically I would imagine that thing, and because of I'm kind of like a feeling really good because of I'm flying, but actually I'm not. Like basically is this thing na ki I'm just imagine I am flying, I'm kind of like simply dodging the clouds and things and that and it just kind of like simply so much wind kind of like a things, then I'm kind of like simply flying like Mach 1 Mach 2 super rapidly and things and that, and now I'm actually creating that sonic boom and stuff like that. Now basically when I try to explain this stuff, it felt really real. It felt really real that ki, yeah, this actually happened. But in real life I'm not flying. I am just staying right here. There is nothing really at all. So what exactly is this thing? Is that ki our mind is kind of like made up in such a way that it creates an illusion inside of us. Now basically, and that illusion is a kind of like something that most of people consider as a reality. And the reality that we are kind of like facing right now is kind of like considered as a kind of like a something is this thing a kind of like a somebody bicycle who is kind of like a stay at stand, but kind of like a somebody our soul could kind of like a somebody go outside and things and that. Like basically it's kind of like something is this thing. Like our soul is kind of like a so fast that we could went into the Mars so rapidly if it just by imagination. Like just imagine I went to the Mars. Yeah, it depends on how you construct that imagination. It depends on kind of like a simply the information that you have. You just need to understand that if I'm kind of like imagine the Mars surface, then I would kind of like imagine that ki kind of like a something little bit orange atmosphere with kind of like a little bit wind, and there is a kind of like a something less amount of oxygen and less amount of gravity. I have this space suit and kind of like I'm trying to walking in this thing. Then there is a kind of like a wind is actually coming with kind of like a so fast with kind of like I can't even withstand and this and that and that. So when I try to imagine when I was in the surface of the Mars, I was kind of like simply imagine everything regarding about the knowledge that I have. But I am at this Earth. I never really been on Mars. Okay, yeah. So how does my imagination feel so real? It's because our mind is kind of like a something makes it real. It's not makes it real. It kind of like a something feels you real. No, what exactly feels you real? What exactly it means? Okay, I'm gonna kind of like simply giving you example. Probably it actually happened with you as also. Okay, yeah. When I first time I kind of like try to learn the Photoshop. Okay, yeah. I was kind of like constantly learning the Photoshop, constantly watching the tutorials and things and that and that. Okay, yeah. Like there is a one day that I wanted to kind of like complete entire Photoshop tutorial in just one day. So I was kind of like decided that I just need to watch the entire Photoshop tutorial and I have to practice. So I was kind of like sit in front of my desk and kind of like started doing Photoshop tutorial and kind of like doing the practice and things and that. I was kind of like doing this thing or almost like a 10 hour non-stop kind of like doing this thing. Okay, and that night I was kind of like something had a dream, and in that dream I was kind of like simply doing my Photoshop. Now basically that dream was so real that I just can't even understand is this kind of like something real or not. Like literally I was kind of like sitting in front of my desk, kind of like doing my Photoshop and kind of like doing my design. It's just so real. But then when I wake up, I realize that dude, it's a dream. And then I realized that how real was that. And this is what kind of like somebody that you also feel that thing. Like basically what I'm trying to tell you is this thing, when you try to learn something new, your mind is kind of like create branches inside of your head. Okay, yeah. And because of you are kind of like spending so much amount of time to kind of like somebody learning that particular thing, you are kind of like utilizing this information again and 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 again. So your mind is kind of like somebody kind of like somebody went into the sleep. It felt like that it should supposed to be like a show that particular stuff, because in the rest of the day you are never really done anything at all. You just constantly doing Photoshop and things like that. So your mind is actually stuck at the Photoshop and it kind of like is showing you that kind of like somebody the way that you are doing and things like that. And because of this thing it felt so real that you just can't even imagine. Like sometimes you just feel like that na, sometimes dreams are become so real that it felt like it is like a fucking real, dude. Yeah, like let me tell you one thing now. If you are kind of like dreaming about running, you actually kind of like something, your body is kind of like a resonate that you are kind of like running. You are kind of like sweating, but you are just sleeping on the couch or sleeping on the bed. But still you are kind of like imagine that you are running a marathon. You just kind of like sweating. You just kind of like losing little bit of calories and things like that. Like how the fuck this thing happened, dude? Okay, yeah, my body is not actually kind of like went into a marathon. My body is not really running, but I'm kind of like imagine as a kind of like somebody running a marathon, and I'm getting tired, legitly, and that felt so real, like really real. Okay, so, and basically this is not just kind of like somebody I'm actually feeling. This is kind of like you also feel that too. This is also kind of like everyone actually feel that too. Now, basically, this thing everyone feels that means like that the people who are in that millions of years ago, they also feel that too. Like when they are kind of like dreaming about something, they are kind of like dreaming about something that feels so real. And when they feel that they kind of like a dream something so real, they kind of like a think that there is a something inside of us. It's kind of like a something, a soul that kind of like drives us. Like basically, like I don't know, I'm kind of like somebody taking a lot of kind of like some assumption are here. I think that now the people who at that particular period of time, they are kind of like a thinking that he probably is this thing that uh, we are just a kind of like a only bicycle, and our soul is a kind of like a something, is this thing that we could kind of like a something, like our soul is kind of like a free and things like that. Okay. Now, the question is that what if our conscious, like this is called kind of like a consciousness, like our soul and things are kind of like are called as a consciousness. Okay, yeah. Now, basically, is this thing like since then people are kind of like consider that it's a kind of like assembly our consciousness and things and that, and basically we are started believing that after the death there is a kind of like assembly something. Now, basically, let's talk about the death first of all here. Okay, yeah. Now, death is a kind of like a universal thing. You are kind of like a born at some day and you will gonna die at some day. That is universal truth, and no one will gonna deny that thing. Okay. Now, basically, if I'm gonna say that people are always curious about death. Okay, yeah. Now, basically, why does people so curious about death? Imagine a scenario. You love your wife. Okay, yeah. But because of your wife is got a heart attack and she died. Okay, yeah. Now, basically, she didn't die at kind of like a old age. No, she died at the age of, let's just say, at the age of 30, or let's just say at the age of 30, 45. Yeah, at the age of 45, your wife is actually dead. Okay, yeah. Now you actually love her too much. Okay, yeah. But you can't even you can't even digest that kind of like information that your wife is actually dead. And when you can't even you can't even absorb that information that your wife is actually dead, you kind of like seeing your wife everywhere. Okay, yeah. And it's not just kind of like a scene, it's kind of like a things that your mind is kind of like creating, that your wife is kind of like a actually exists at somewhere. Okay. And you can see your wife at kind of like a somewhere. Okay, yeah. Now, basically, is this thing that is completely false. Okay, no one is actually saw the dead person, nothing at all. Then why that particular person says that thing he saw his dead wife is because of that particular person really loved her. It's same example that actually happened. Like basically, is this thing that if I'm kind of like spending almost like 8-10 hours of doing the Photoshop, my brain is kind of like showing that kind of like a Photoshop when I was in the dream. So same thing happened that when you are love that particular person and you are kind of like spending almost like an entire life with that particular person, and suddenly that particular person is actually gone, so your brain is kind of like showing that she is actually exist at somewhere. And brain, you are kind of like showing that like this is kind of like exist, like a might be she kind of like talk to you and things, and that it's not kind of like somebody she is actually talking to you. It's kind of like somebody is this thing, your brain thinks that she is actually talking to you. Now, other people are not really believing that particular thing, because like it's like basically other people are not believing that thing because people are not really believing that thing. Oh yeah. Why? Because we are living in modern world and we know that soul and consciousness is not actually exist without the body and things like that. And is because of kind of like only we are living in modern world. But if I'm gonna say, like let's just say millions of years ago, when the people who are kind of like somebody say some sort of thing, then people started believing that. People started to believe that there is maybe kind of like something that after the death there is might be a people might gonna survive. So because of this thing, because of all the kind of like a something, and as also we are also human too. Okay, yeah, being human means like that we are always kind of like a seek the information. Now, if when we are not getting the valid information, we are started believe in wrong information, and this is what our mind does it. It's our mind is kind of like always believe in some sort of information, whether it's wrong or right. It just need kind of like need to believe in some sort of information, because our mind is kind of like a wants information. Okay, yeah. Why do you mean mind is kind of like a need information? Okay, yeah. We are living in such a world where kind of like we are occupied by a lot of things. Specifically, take a mobile phone. Okay, yeah. Even if you don't really have anything at all, you have mobile phone, and when you have mobile phone, you can do anything at all. You will not get bored anything at all. Now let's compare to the dog. Okay, yeah. Basically, your dog doesn't really have anything at all. Like, basically, what could it do? Like, basically, it play with you. It kind of like eat some sort of food and things like that. But rest of the time, he just kind of like sitting and kind of like sleeping and nothing really at all. And most of the kind of like a species are kind of like doing the same thing. They're just kind of like somebody just, yeah. Why does they do that? Is because of they don't really have anything to do. Why? Because their mind is not really developed that enough to kind of like somebody seek the information and things and that and that. But our mind is something very different. Our mind is kind of like somebody that we need information. We need information and we just always seek for information. That's why we just kind of like always scroll through reels and things like that. We always gonna watch kind of like a bunch of videos and TVs and things like that. That's why we could read the books and things like that. That's why we could communicate with the people and things like that. Like, basically is this thing, the boring is a kind of like such a state that probably is this thing that our mind is kind of like a need. It's like, basically, why does boring feel so boring? Okay, yeah. Let's just say that you went to somewhere. Let's just say you went to kind of like a some solitary prison. Okay, in the solitary prison, they don't let you do anything at all. Okay, yeah. They kind of like obviously they will not kind of like give you any mobile phone or things or that. You just kind of like went into solitary prison and just stay for almost like maybe a week. Okay, yeah. So in a week, you don't really have anything at all. Your mind is just so fucking fucked up. I think happened now. Your mind really required kind of like some information, because in the solitary camp, you not even kind of like somebody getting a sound from somewhere else. It just completely like a empty room with nothing. And when this thing actually happened, your mind is kind of like somebody crippled inside of it. And it kind of like a somebody that we are doing something with some sort of nonsense stuff. Now, what is actually nonsense stuff that we are doing? We are kind of like a clapping our hands. We are kind of like somebody creating kind of like some sort of information from whatever from our body. Like, basically clapping our hand, or kind of like somebody doing something like a singing for loud and things and that and that and that. Now, what is exactly that we call them? Mad, right? Like, basically, if the other people are like, if this person is kind of like doing such a thing, we actually consider that this person is kind of like a mad or something. No, this person is not really mad. This person is kind of like somebody not having the information to consume that much. Because let me tell you one thing, our mind is actually meant to consume information, whatever the information that is. Okay, yeah. So that's why it's kind of like something is this thing. That's why our mind is kind of like always seek for information. And millions of years ago, there is a kind of like information regarding about the people started seeing the dead people, and people started believing that, because a mind is always need information, and that's why we are started believing that yeah, there is a kind of like something very different than that person, and that's why we are kind of like believing that there is a consciousness, there is a kind of like something, the soul is kind of like something exist and things like that. Okay, yeah, because our mind is kind of like in such a way. Okay, yeah. It just creates its own reality. Like, basically that, like the simple thing, you can imagination. You can imagine something. You can imagine that you have a kind of like a glass of milkshake in your hand. Even if there is nothing really at all, still you could feel the weight of in your hand. How is actually happened? Because of your imagination, dude. And that is kind of like somebody one of the greatest gifts that we have. That's why we could kind of like evolve that much. That's why we have this building, cars, and this society, and the way that just look at around yourself. What kind of like somebody difference between us and other species? Like, what exactly is this thing? Your mind, right? That is the only thing that kind of like somebody very much different than other species. And because of this thing, look at around yourself. Like, basically because of our mind, we create this reality. Okay, yeah. At some time we kind of like consider as a kind of like some imagination, but we are living in this particular imagination. Almost like 100 years ago, like basically, no, almost not 100 years ago, almost like let's just say 200 years ago. Okay, yeah. people are kind of like a something that ki they not really believe that ki they would kind of like a communicate other person in other part of world. But right now we could communicate. We have this mobile phone. We could communicate anyone at any part of the world. It take kind of like a little bit delay regarding about the signal and transportation and things and that, but still we could communicate. And it's kind of like a somebody is this thing that we are utilizing our mind and imagination and things like that. Okay, so basically the question is that ki, like basically what if the consciousness was kind of like a somebody alive, or what if is kind of like a somebody the consciousness what if our consciousness is actually alive after the death? Like this actually thought process actually came from this kind of like a misconception regarding about things and that. All right. So basically, the consciousness is not exist without your body. Now, why? Why is that? Because it's actually connected with us. It's actually connected with our mind. You dead. That's it. In reality, there is no ghost, there is no soul, there is no consciousness. You just die. It just die. Okay, yeah. Because your mind is actually create the illusion, and if you don't really have a mind, then who is actually creating the illusion? Okay, yeah. So basically, it's this thing that basically the consciousness is not gonna survive when you die and things like that. Then why this kind of like a question is actually asked and things like that is because of that people are always kind of like disbelieve in some sort of thing. Like people kind of like always thinks that like we are living in such a world where almost like 8 billion people are actually exist. Obviously none of those people have kind of like a same opinion regarding about anything at all. Everyone has a different mind, and everyone has a kind of like a different thought process, and everyone kind of like a free to think that what he was a kind of like a thinking. We cannot control other people's thought process and things like that. So basically it is okay to other people things, and that's why we could kind of like somebody stuck in this particular question that what if consciousness kind of like should supposed to survive in this, should supposed to be alive after the death. Now let's just imagine that reality. Oh yeah, what if that kind of like a somebody consciousness is kind of like a something alive after the death? If this thing actually happened, then meaning of the life would be changed. Okay, yeah. Means like that our meaning of the life is kind of like, what is exactly meaning of life? What exactly is this thing? Okay, yeah. Since you wake up, okay, yeah, like sorry, since you born, you do kind of like a couple of things. Okay, yeah. Like basically since you born, you went to school, then you went to kind of like a college, then you went to kind of like doing a job, then you kind of like married, then you kind of like have a kids, then you kind of like somebody doing your job, and then kind of like at someday you will gonna die and things like that. Now this is the kind of like a couple of rules that we have, okay, in the real world, in the modern world. Okay, yeah. Now let's compare to the kind of, let's just try to consider as a kind of like millions of years ago what the life would be. Millions of years ago, people are kind of like somebody born, and they just kind of like learn how to hunt. Okay, yeah. At the beginning, they are kind of like a hunting at kind of like a somebody at neighborhood, like at neighborhood jungle and things like that. But since we grown up, we are kind of like a somebody have very stronger arms and things and that. So it's really essential to go to wilderness, and we are kind of like a hunting, gather food, and take that food to our kind of like a somebody the gang, and we would kind of like share that food, and we would kind of like share the stories and things and that and stuff like that. So basically what exactly is this thing? A millions of a year ago, we are kind of like somebody we are just kind of like somebody survive because we need a food for survival and things like that. But in this modern world, survival is not the kind of like a things that we should supposed to know. We are kind of like somebody doing this thing is because of that we have some sort of life, and we wanted to achieve some sort of things. Okay, yeah, that's why we are kind of like somebody doing education, get a job, and kind of like somebody live the life as much as better as we can. Okay, yeah. Now this is our life. Okay, yeah. Now in this reality, that what if our consciousness is kind of like a something alive after the death? It means what? That we actually consider that our consciousness is always gonna alive after the death. So basically what will gonna happen, that we will gonna make sure that our spiritual should supposed to be become much better. Like we always consider that our human body is just a radio, and our consciousness is kind of like a somewhere at something. We are kind of like a some radio that emitting kind of like a some actions and sounds and things and that. But after we die, signal is still there. Okay, yeah, and they need a kind of like a some certain body, and they kind of like a went into some certain another body. Okay, another person bodies and things and that. So we are kind of like making sure that our spiritual should supposed to be good. Like our spiritual energy or spiritual kind of like a thing should supposed to be good. And how do we supposed to make it good? Like a somebody somebody doing something really good thing, like basically kind of like a somebody helping poor, or kind of like a not doing any kind of like a wrong thing or things like that. Because we are started believing that like basically is this thing, our consciousness is die is because of that if we are kind of like a doing wrong thing, then probably we are kind of like a making sure that we should supposed to be do a good thing. Like we will not gonna kill anybody, we would kind of like always be focused on kind of like a mental clarity, we will gonna always help others and things and that. So that we would consider that our consciousness, the next life of our consciousness should supposed to be get something that kind of like a somebody better, like let's just say better means a human, another human that kind of like a somebody do something good or things like that. Okay, yeah, like basically the meaning of the life would be changed. Okay, yeah, like basically in our life we are kind of like making sure our life is good, but in this reality we are kind of like making sure our spiritual soul should supposed to be good. So that's why we would kind of like doing the meditation. Yeah, we would do the kind of like a little bit education too, but our education is not meant to be kind of like a somebody getting a kind of like a money and things. No, it's kind of like a meeting, it's only for kind of like a somebody is this thing that had enough money should supposed to be earned so that you should supposed to be survive, but mostly focus on kind of like a spiritual success or things like that. Okay, yeah, meditation, yoga, helping other, kind of like a somebody whatever it is. So war will not gonna happen and things and that. Like probably if I'm gonna imagine this thing, that would be kind of like a somebody really different and stuff like that. Okay, yeah. Do you believe that there is a kind of like a somebody conspiracy, and there is a kind of like a somebody is this thing that ghost and soul is actually exist at somewhere? No, I am not believing that. Okay, it's just kind of like somebody, like I believe that there is a human, the consciousness actually exists till we alive. When we die, it just die with it. That's it. Okay, yeah. Okay, like basically I didn't see any kind of like a dead body or things like that. Like I seen the dead body. Sorry, I seen the dead body. But I didn't see any kind of like a person who is alive after the dead body. I kind of like a get little bit of memories of peoples, of things and that, and something like that. And basically it's okay because I understand what is actually this. Other people not really understand, so that's why they believe that there is a consciousness actually alive after the death. Whatever, it's a kind of like a somebody very wild topic. Okay, yeah. If I'm gonna start talking about this thing, people has a different opinion and things like that. Okay, some people kind of like a believe that there is a kind of like a ghost that exists, and they are kind of like showing a lot of kind of like a evidence regarding about that. But I don't know. The reality that we are construct is not the reality that we are seeing, the reality that we believe, and that is what they see, and that is what I didn't really see. Whatever, this is it, this is done, and thank you.